If you were around for the launch of the Super Nintendo in 1991, you know the big deal it was that it had a port of Capcom's popular arcade beat-em-up Final Fight. It started with Japanese previews for the Super Famicom version, claims that the visuals were incredible and almost arcade perfect, and they were right. Final Fight on the Super Nintendo looked and sounded about as close to the arcade as you could have hoped. I mean, even looking at it today, you really have to respect what was done with a simple 8 megabit cartridge. But as nice as the presentation was, all was not perfect with the Nintendo port of Final Fight. It was missing Guy, and the 2-player co-op was MIA as well. Despite that, it received some fairly positive reviews. Sega knew they needed an answer. They needed something in the same genre, but hit all the notes that Final Fight came up short with. That began a new project that Sega would handle internally by Sega CS team members who had worked on projects like Altered Beast, eSWAT City Under Siege, Strider, Castle of Illusion, and Last Battle. This dream team also had the well-respected Yuzo Koshiro on board to compose the music, as well as Takayuki Nakamura, who assisted with the sound, a veteran himself that had worked on classics like Moonwalker and the GG Shinobi. Sega had meant for this to be a winner, a Final Fight killer, and they had the staff to make it happen. In this episode, we will be reviewing Streets of Rage, one of Sega's most beloved creations of the 16-bit era. Our story begins in a city beset by crime and anarchy. Its citizens are being attacked, its businesses looted, and the local government and police force seemingly have no answers. A group of young police officers realize that there is a powerful force behind the scenes pulling the strings, paying off officials, and causing this once great city to teeter on the precipice of complete ruin. Fed up with the constraints of their badges, these three friends decide enough is enough and go after the syndicate responsible for all the lawlessness. There's Adam Hunter, a powerful boxer, Axel Stone, a well-rounded martial artist, and Blaze Fielding, a judo master with lightning-fast reflexes. Each one has their own skill sets and moves with varying effectiveness. Adam is powerful, Blaze is fast, and Axel is somewhere in between. Each of our heroes share a core of moves that can be pulled off at any time. There's a simple standing combo that knocks down your foe, there's a jump kick that reaches much further than a standard attack, there's a reversal that allows you to hit an approaching assailant behind you, then there's the grapple, which initiates a few different options. You can engage in a series of rapid hits, you can toss the enemy over your head, and you can do a flip behind them, right into a powerful backdrop. You also have the ability to recover from a throw, and counter grabs from behind you. No beat 'em up would be complete without weapons, and there are 5 here you can pick up to help you in battle. The glass bottle is a smash and stab weapon you'll see quite often, and then there's a knife that can be used up close or thrown across the screen. Then there's both a lead pipe and a baseball bat that can be used for great reach, wiping out whomever it hits. Finally, there is a pepper shaker that stuns your attacker, but doesn't do any damage by itself. Various things in the environment also hide things like food, extra lives, and extra nuke attacks. Enemies come in a few different varieties. You have the basic street punk that comes in a few different color schemes. These guys like to hit and run and sneak attacks. There's the Mohawk sporting group that loves to throw you or initiate a slide attack to knock you down. There's the whip-wielding dominatrix clan that has major reach and should be avoided head-on. The Syndicate also had their own Kung Fu posse that loves kicking you from long distances. Apparently, the Syndicate isn't without a sense of humor, because they have an entire legion of felons skilled in the art of juggling. These clowns throw torches and axes at you from across the screen, and are really tough to grapple. You also get a slew of bosses that have special weapons and abilities to make their fight as challenging as possible. Some throw boomerangs, some have Wolverine claws, there's a barbarian that loves to rush you, and a heavyset fella with flame breath, and even a couple of twins that fight just as ferociously as Blaze. Finally, there are 8 stages to battle across, and there is 2-player co-op for your family and friends. When Streets of Rage released in the summer of 1991, it came on a 4 megabit cartridge, which was pretty standard for the time. Despite that, it manages to be a great looking title overall. You get a good mix of stage locations that have small details that really stand out. You have the neon lights of the local boardwalk, the back alleys of the city streets, the nighttime glow of docked ships. Compared to Final Fight, the sprites are smaller, but you get more of them on screen. That's in addition to the co-op multiplayer. I really did love the choices Sega made for this game visually. It feels like a city where you are in the most dangerous of places. What you see in the backgrounds really impact the environment and how everything feels. Of course, as nice as that may be, that 4 megabit cartridge still leaves some things rather lacking. The enemy variety is anemic to the point of being comical. You are literally battling the same handful of enemies the entire way, and you even replay the boss characters multiple times. It wasn't uncommon to palette swap enemies back then, but here it still leaves you fighting precious few bad guys the entire way. If I had to level a strong critique in this regard, Sega really should have made this a 5 or 6 megabit cartridge and added a few more enemies and bosses to give it some much needed variety. Streets of Rage was a nice looking game by 1991 standards, but 4 megs was just too small to really make this the best it could possibly be. If you were around back then to experience Streets of Rage for the very first time, you know that the sound and the music of this title deserves its legendary status. I can't stress enough how much the music means to this game. It's as important as the visuals and gameplay easily. The quality was extraordinary and showed that the FM synth-based Genesis could belt out some incredible tunes. Composer Yuzo Koshiro crafted stage-specific tracks that felt like something you'd actually hear at the locations, if the environment could actually speak. I don't think any game before or since has relied so heavily on its soundtrack to be such a huge part of the experience. But don't take my word for it, let's have some examples to see what you think. As you can probably imagine, it's pretty much impossible to review this and not take into account its incredible follow-up. Streets of Rage 2 improved on this formula in so many ways, it's easy to think that the original is utterly not worth playing today. I reject this notion and would even argue the original stands on its own with a very powerful identity. The first is darker, grittier, and the music sets the stage for that specifically. It's not better or worse, it's just different, and that means more than I can possibly describe with just a few words here. When it landed in 1991, it was Final Fight that was its competitor, however, and as far as the Super Nintendo port is concerned, I don't feel it was even close. Streets of Rage absolutely destroyed Final Fight in gameplay and music, not to mention it had multiple endings. You could face the final boss Mr. X as a team, or try to seize power for yourself. The only area that Final Fight could claim a win here is visuals, but those visuals came with huge concessions that greatly impacted the quality of the home port. I mean, losing the 2-player co-op in the Super Nintendo Final Fight was a huge blow. But I also want to stress how much better Streets of Rage was than pretty much every game of this type on the Genesis itself. The gameplay felt so nice, with perfect feeling contact between players and enemies. Every punch, kick, grab, throw, and weapon connected in a satisfying way that kept the gameplay momentum going strong. Once you mixed in that perfect soundtrack in the 2-player co-op, it was perhaps the very best this genre had ever been. Genuinely, the only weakness it had as a product of 1991 was the lacking enemy variety. I mean, we are talking 5 different enemies here? There are some palette swaps, but they still look the same and the AI and animation are virtually the same. Luckily, the stage variety is strong enough to offset some of that disappointment. I really can't be any harder on Streets of Rage than that. While the sequel was certainly better in many ways, you simply can't dismiss how good this was in 1991. It was a powerful reason the Genesis sold so well that year, and remains one of the most memorable experiences for the platform. While Genesis owners were basking in the glory of this beat-em-up masterpiece, 8-bit Sega fans had their own city to rescue. Streets of Rage for the Master System was an incredibly well-done port, with great graphics and a soundtrack that was shockingly familiar. Even the Game Gear got its own version of Streets of Rage, so you could take the action on the go. After the overwhelming success of these titles, Sega went full steam ahead with multiple sequels that had greatly improved visuals and many more moves. That makes going back to the first tier a questionable choice if the sequels were so much improved, right? I really don't feel that way. The original Streets of Rage really does look, sound, and play so different from the other entries that it very much stands on its own. Seriously, the darker, more subdued artistry on display here is a stark contrast to the brighter, more colorful sequels. The gameplay also feels completely unique, not relying on the later game's special moves, and leaving you to focus more on the core combat, its weapons, and its grapple moves. I'd also like to express my undying love for the soundtrack of this one. All the music in this series has a certain appeal, but the stuff in this one was perhaps Yuzo Koshiro's best work. Not necessarily because it's fundamentally better than the other stuff, but more a case that it fits every single stage here like a glove. The back alleys have dogs barking in the distance. The factory sounds so mechanical with its deep bass and deliberate pacing. And those beach tunes are so upbeat and energetic, just like a dance party in the wee hours of the morning. You bring in a healthy dose of nostalgia on top of that perfection, and Streets of Rage is still a game that makes you proud to own a Genesis till this very day. To me, it was easily one of the most important pieces of Sega's success story in the early 1990s. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. In 1991, Sega had its answer to Final Fight in Streets of Rage. It was known as Bare Knuckle in Japan, and it used a similar blueprint to Capcom's masterpiece to build a brand new beat-em-up just for Genesis owners. Sega got Revenge of Shinobi's composer on board to do the honors for the music, and when it hit the market, it was lavished with critical acclaim. I absolutely loved it myself, and it quickly rose up the ranks as one of my favorite games for the Genesis platform. It was a massive hit for Sega, so they quickly got a Part 2 into development for release the following year. Sega CS would once again be part of development, and with the project being significantly larger, they'd get help from Ancient and a few other smaller developers to make it happen. The product they put out was released in December of 1992, and it's one of the finest games ever made. Streets of Rage 2 had some pretty big shoes to fill following the first. Sega could have just recycled the same great gameplay, but they instead went a few steps further. You still have the same basic arsenal as before. You attack with your standard combo of punches and kicks, you have your standard jump attacks that change depending on whether you are moving or not, and you can still attack behind you. Also returning is the ability to land on your feet when thrown, as well as your grapple system. This affords you a new set of options such as additional combos and throws. Sega decided to axe the call for police backup from the first, instead giving us a new special attack system. The first of these is a standard special that you can do anytime you want without penalty. It's pulled off by pressing forward attack and hits multiple times. The second set of specials is more restrictive but can be devastating in their execution. These are tied directly to their own special button. Hit that button by itself and you sort of get a nuke attack that hits everything in front and behind you. Press forward in the special button and you get a second version that is often radically different. Beware, however, your special attacks take life each and every time you use them. The really cool thing about all that is that you now have 4 characters that you can use all those moves with. Axel and Blaze make their triumphant return, joined by newcomer Skate and Max. Skate is the little brother of Adam and Max is a friend of Axel's. While each of these characters do share the same input methods for their movesets, they are radically different in practice. Not only do they have their own stats for things like power, speed, and stamina, but each of their moves vary radically in style and effectiveness. Skate is small and fast but does little damage. Max is powerful but slow. Adam is completely missing in this game thanks to the story. It seems Mr. X is back and he's taken Adam prisoner, and his new gangs are ready to rain absolute vengeance on the city. That means you of course have to stop him, and you'll battle across 8 stages to do it. You'll start downtown, work your way across the bridge, deal with punks in an amusement park and a stadium before you make your final run on a ship, in a jungle, and finally, Mr. X's weapons plant and stronghold. The 2-player co-op is of course back, as is a new duel mode where you can practice all these new moves with a friend. The first Streets of Rage came on a tiny 4 megabit cartridge, a byproduct of its time. Streets of Rage 2 here comes on a comparatively massive 16 megabit cart, a full 4 times increase in size. Sega needed all that extra memory because they wanted to make this new entry as pretty as they possibly could. The results are spectacular too. Gone are the tiny sprites of the original, now replaced by massive heroes and villains that easily fill up the screen. Backgrounds have been given a big facelift as well. You get a lot more detail, there are some cool new touches like foreground scrolling and some nice line and parallax effects. The animation sees some major increases across the board as well. Not only does everyone walk and fight smoother, but there's a lot more bad guys on top of that. You get the usual grunts of course, but you also get a nice mix of henchmen that vary in fight style and moves. It makes for a heck of a lot to see and do, making the first seem like it was a generation apart. The 8 stages you play across have a nice amount of scenery change-ups to complement the new engine. Every area has its own look and ambiance about it, and you'll notice few repeated assets beyond the enemies. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of all of that is just how much more colorful everything is. It's not like the first one was a slouch in that area, but everything about it has been brightened up here and then some. In my humble opinion, this is one of the most dramatic improvements any series pulled off during that generation of software. Streets of Rage had an incredible soundtrack. I mean, it was the kind of stuff you could listen to over and over in and out of the game. That was thanks to the great Yuzo Koshiro and his masterclass control over FM synth. He wove a tapestry of aural goodness that still gives me goosebumps today. It was only right for him to return and make sweet sweet love to our ears in part 2, and thankfully, he delivers another epic performance. I could continue to swing from this man's sack for another 20 minutes or so, but instead I'll spare you the long-winded soliloquy and let you hear it for yourselves. Playing Streets of Rage 2 for the first time was a shock to say the least. I had loved Part 1, even preferred its gameplay to many other popular beat-em-ups at the time. But Sega outdid themselves with this one. Not only did they get the Neo Geo-like upgrade to the visuals and Yuzo's killer tunes, but that gameplay saw just as big an improvement. Every attack lands with a perfect smack, a satisfying stun, and ultimately, your foe collapsing to the ground in screen-shaking defeat. The 4 playable characters offer up gameplay that is very much their own too. No 2 play alike. Hell, no 2 even play similar. And I'm not talking just in terms of speed or how much life they take. I'm also talking about style and effectiveness on different enemies. Some bad guys can block regular attacks, some can power right through your specials, and some can even counter you before you even land the first punch. I think much of the appeal of this one is that it gives you the ability to deal with all that how you want. Prefer the power guy popping off uppercuts left and right? He's there. Want the small guy that whips around the screen getting his beat down on in style? You got that too. Moving through the game world, you are also met with some crazy places to do battle in. It feels like a journey as you move through town, eventually taking a ship that puts you on the trail of where Mr. X has been hiding out. Of course, all of that is made better by the 2-player co-op that runs perfectly the entire time. My only real complaint is that Adam isn't playable. As my favorite character in Part 1, I understood the need to have him as a story element, but he still could have been an unlockable or something. To omit him entirely from gameplay was a real downer. Aside from that little irritation, Streets of Rage 2 is about as perfect as a 16-bit brawler can be. Sega wasn't afraid to bring Streets of Rage 2 to its 8-bit platform, surprisingly. The first of these hit the Game Gear in 1993. Of course, it had no hope of looking as good as the 16-bit powered edition, but Sega's portable still did an admirable job all the same. The gameplay is surprisingly tight, and most of the moves are here. They even added a special attack that wasn't in the Genesis version. Yuzo was back for the sound in this one, making for a damn good beat-em-up on the go. The following year, Europe, Brazil, and Korea all got the Master System port, which was actually not just a redux of the portable version. And while I normally praise there being different versions for every Sega platform, this one is actually quite a bit weaker than the others. It doesn't look or play as well as the Game Gear release. The animation is kinda janky, the hit detection feels off, and the enemies move around too fast. It's not broken, but between the two, I'd prefer the Game Gear take every single time. The legacy of Streets of Rage 2 is undeniable. Whether you grew up a Sega fan or not, the quality of this game's programming is god tier in the land of 4th generation hardware. It's a tour de force of graphics, sound, and gameplay, and easily stands out as a star of the beat-em-up genre. While the first game was memorable in its own right, the improvements here take it to another level. In a way, it's kind of a shame because the product was so well done, the sequel had a nearly insurmountable task in front of it. How do you improve on perfection? How do you take something so well designed and make it feel new again? All Sega could pretty much do is give us more of the same or try something radically different, paths that would disappoint some people no matter what. Despite the critical and commercial success of Streets of Rage 2, Sega only gave us one more game in the series before giving up on it completely. That third release never saw a sequel on the Saturn or Dreamcast, a despicable fact if there's ever been one in the hobby of gaming. How does a company not iterate on such a fan-beloved favorite? Would it have been difficult? Sure, but how do you leave behind the software that spurred on millions of imaginations and helped build the foundation of all your successes? Just imagine if Nintendo had left Mario, Zelda, Metroid, or Donkey Kong on the NES never to be heard from again. It would take over 20 years before we finally received a sequel to the 16-bit series known as Streets of Rage, a reality that still baffles me to this very day. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. Among Sega fans, the Streets of Rage series demands a certain level of respect that few games can equal. The original debuted in 1991 on the Sega Genesis and became an instant classic. The music, the gameplay, and its gritty world really scratched that beat-em-up itch that fans had been craving. The following year, Streets of Rage 2 appeared on the Genesis with some major improvements to the graphics, another kick-ass soundtrack, and even better gameplay. It's often considered one of the platform's best games and is spoken of highly by even Nintendo fans. This of course meant that the expectations for a Part 3 were sky high. The first two had been reasons to brag for Sega fans, so anything less than stellar was simply unimaginable. Something was clearly wrong, however. The first two Streets of Rage games had been released in North America nearly at the same time as their Japanese counterparts, where the series was named Bare Knuckle. But Part 3 hit Japan first in March of 1994, with gaming magazines covering it in their import sections. The Western version wouldn't show up until months later in the summer, a side effect of the numerous changes that Sega of America would make to the product. In this episode, we will be taking a look at Streets of Rage 3, the controversy of its English localization, and talk a bit about its quality. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Streets of Rage 3 for the Sega Genesis. If you've played Streets of Rage 2, Part 3 feels very similar in the gameplay department, but adjusts and adds a few things to really improve the overall experience. First is the addition of the duck and roll. Using this, you can quickly move to the front or rear of the play area to avoid attacks or to get a better position to confront enemies. It's accomplished by pressing up or down twice quickly for the direction you want to go. You also now have a dash to quickly get across the screen. Pressing twice left or right quickly allows you to run, a big upgrade that really speeds up the gameplay. There are also some new attacks based on running. There is also a new gauge that governs your power and special attacks. In the previous game, using your special attacks drained a bit of life every time, but here you get to use them without penalty if you wait for the strength gauge to rebuild. It makes for a better balancing gameplay and allows you more freedom with your moveset. Be wary, however. While you hit harder and do more damage when the gauge is high, you are also weaker and take more damage while it's low. Finally, your blitz attacks have a star system in place that give them more power. As your score goes up, you gain up to 3 stars that make your blitz moves more effective. These stars stay with you until you take a death, which will downgrade you by 1 each time. Outside of these additions and changes, the gameplay is largely similar overall. Blitz attacks are still performed the same, attacking enemies behind you is the same, and the grapple system is largely untouched. There is a noticeable speed increase here, but it isn't jarring or unwelcome. Astal, Blaze, and Skate make a return, and there is a newcomer called Dr. Zan who's part cyborg. There's even a few hidden characters now. 2-player co-op multiplayer of course is in there, as is the battle mode that allows you to fight a friend. And rounding out all these additions are the multiple endings you can get that really add to the replay value. Streets of Rage 2 had been an impressive upgrade visually over the first, and Part 3 doesn't mess with a good thing. We get a very similar looking experience here with large sprites, detailed environments, and a performance that rarely sees any slowdown or flicker. There are some enhancements to the animation thanks to the new moves you can do, and there are some new enemies in there as well. Perhaps the greatest visual asset, however, is the stage variety. Now coming in at 24 megabits, each and every stage is radically different from one another, and you rarely see assets reused. From oceanside battles to running from a bulldozer, there's always something new to see and do. While I appreciate this variety, it seems to come at the cost of special effects like parallax scrolling and similar graphical features. Luckily, other areas help shoulder the load. The color is excellent, the enemies detailed, and your fighter looks incredible. It isn't the leap Part 2 was over Part 1, but still quite the solid looking beat 'em up. The one area that the first 2 Streets of Rage games really nailed was the music. These are 2 of my favorite soundtracks of the entire 16-bit generation. They were absolutely perfect, and set the entire tone and feel of those games. Part 3 here doesn't quite live up to those 2 games, however. It feels like music producer Yuzo Koshiro really let his experimental flag fly, and the results were interesting to say the least. While I did enjoy some of the selections, most of it simply didn't live up to the stuff we had before. It felt more random and had a much harder edge. I'd even go so far as to say there are sounds here that are genuinely off-putting. Here are a few examples for you to see for yourselves. You can't talk about Streets of Rage 3 without bringing up the regional changes that exist between the Japanese and English versions. These changes range from little things like colors and names used for the main cast of characters and enemies, to major changes such as censorship and difficulty. First and foremost, the English versions are noticeably more difficult. Enemies do more damage to you, and you take longer to kill them. In Streets of Rage 3, the game cannot be finished on easy, and instead ends at stage 5 with a bad ending that basically says you suck. Female enemies have also been covered up in the Western versions, and the homosexual boss Ash has been removed entirely. Astal, Blaze, and Skate have different colored outfits, and most of the enemies, weapons, and bosses have been renamed. The story to the two versions are also radically different. In Japan, Bare Knuckle 3 has a story about an experimental weapon that is capable of massive damage. It's used in the city, killing thousands of civilians. You are sent in to uncover the people behind it all and stop the war they are trying to start. In the English versions, you get a lame-ass plot about Mr. X replacing people with robots. There are other smaller differences in color and set pieces here and there as well. Of all these changes, the difficulty is the biggest. No joke, playing these games back to back, it's clear the Japanese version is considerably easier. While that will matter to some more than others, it made a huge difference during co-op gameplay. While just about anyone could play the first two Streets of Rage games on normal, Part 3 will massacre lesser players, making a playthrough with family and friends a somewhat taxing experience. Gimping the easy mode in the English release also exacerbates the issue because you can't finish the game. Sega was unwisely concerned about making games harder because they were hyper-focused on game rentals at the time. This came to the detriment of some of their titles, this one included. I want to be real clear here. I think the improvements to Streets of Rage 3's gameplay are very nice. It's faster, there are more moves, and it makes for a better playing and feeling experience. Pound for pound, it's the best playing of the original 16-bit trilogy by a mile. The addition of multiple endings is cool as well. These endings aren't just based on some simple text choice either. They depend on your difficulty setting and how well you perform during certain situations. There are some things about Streets of Rage 3 that really hurt it for me, however. While the story changes and censorship bothered some people, I didn't really care much about any of that. Bare Knuckle 3 was in Japanese and I didn't understand the story anyway, and I really didn't care about the costume changes either. What I did care about is what made the first two games such an incredible experience: the music. I can't really sugarcoat my feelings here. Even stating that the music in Streets of Rage 3 is an acquired taste would be dishonest. Much of what is here is point-blank painful to the ears, and it's the kind of painful that gets worse and more irritating the longer you listen to it. Whereas the stuff in the first two games set a tone and ambiance that enhanced the setting and gameplay, there's stuff in Part 3 that feels like someone put a bunch of monkeys in a room to bang on pots and pans for an hour. The sad thing is that some of the entries are actually really good, but the gulf between the good and the bad is absolutely massive. You'll go from something that isn't bad at all to wanting to mute the television a few minutes later. I can deal with all the minor changes. I can deal with the game being harder. What I can't deal with is an eccentric soundtrack that ranges in quality so hard that it took one of the finest elements of the series and threw it straight out the window. I'd also like to mention that while Streets of Rage 3 is still a good-looking game, its surprising lack of parallax and line scrolling effects do impact its appeal. Here you get more stages with backgrounds that are flat and lacking depth, something that should have been ramped up heavily. There's even a few visual assets recycled from the second game. My final complaint will fall on deaf ears for some of you, but why the hell is Adam not playable, or at least a hit and unlockable? I mean, the dude was in the main cast of the first one, then reduced to a simple plot point in the second, and again here in the third, he's back to a cameo-style appearance just to say he's there. This is bullshit. I know there are fans of Skate and Zan out there, so I won't belittle their contribution, but to omit Adam again is straight up annoying. I mean, they made a freaking kangaroo playable over him. Streets of Rage 2 had been such a hit that the sequel had a hell of a task in front of it to equal. I think Sega did an excellent job expanding the gameplay to meet that challenge. It really does play better, it's faster, there are more moves, more variety, and it just feels like a true upgrade. But there are things here that will affect how many of you feel about it. The changes in the English versions are head-scratching to say the least. The story has been simplified to the point where it makes you think Sega felt its Western fans were morons, and that difficulty spike was simply unnecessary. If Sega wanted to make the game harder, they should have just set the default difficulty to hard, and given us incentives to play it like additional unlockables that you could only get by playing it. Luckily, there is an English translation of the Japanese version these days to offset most of the changes Sega of America made. But as I said, the music selections here are the biggest hurdle to overcome. For those of you that enjoyed the previous entries and expect more of the same, well, you had your work cut out for you. The entire feel of this soundtrack is different, and it likely will be the biggest influencer on your opinion of the rest of the game. For me, Streets of Rage 3 was an excellent playing, good-looking beat-em-up with a soundtrack that I sometimes liked and I sometimes couldn't stand. This stood in direct contrast to the earlier games, which were all excellent all the way around. This leaves Part 2 here in a weird place of being both better and worse at the same time. It makes for a hell of a conversation piece with a wide swath of opinions. If you haven't played it but enjoy beat-em-ups, I do recommend you try it out. After all, a Streets of Rage with issues is still one hell of a great experience. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.